The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Well, good evening, everyone. Just a quick reminder or to point out to those who are joining us for the first time, and I'm sure there are multitudes out there just listening with eagerness. Anyway, this is a live call-in show, so you can call in and join Lang's and my discussion, 343-9927, 343-9927. Give us a call, share your ideas, tell us we're full of baloney or whatever. Anyhow, I mentioned Lang Baker. Lang is here with us tonight to discuss our topic. Lang, good evening.
Hi, Wayne.
And thanks again for your hard work, actually, your research that you always do every week. And I seem to pale beside you in the amount of the volume of knowledge that you bring to the shows. But anyhow, our topic tonight is the South China Sea and the controversies surrounding it lately. And before we get into both lately and historically, because as we discussed before the show, there have been a lot of historically the South China Sea has been in dispute with everyone or by everyone. But what are we talking about here, the South China Sea? What specifically and what generally? You were talking about the size of it earlier. And
yeah, it's almost 1.5 million square miles, which makes it almost half the size of the continental United States, more than twice the size of the Gulf of Mexico, and much larger than the Caribbean Sea.
And it's somewhere south,
and it's south of China and to the east of Vietnam and the west of the Philippines and north of Borneo, and then it swings back up into the Gulf of Siam, which is
Gulf of Thailand, as we know
where
it,
where the coast of Thailand and Cambodia are. And there are some disputes among those nations over that area, but China's not a party to those disputes.
Okay, Malaysia fits in there somewhere too, right?
Yeah, Malaysia is down on the southern end of that Malay Peninsula, where the northern part of that peninsula is part of Thailand.
Okay. And I'm looking at probably the same map you are, but there are, I guess, two sets of islands that the Chinese want to control pretty much the entire sea.
The Chinese drew, it was back in 1947, I believe, after the Second World War, when much of that area was freed from Japanese imperial control, and the Chinese declared that the South China Sea was part of China and drew what they called then the 11-dash line, which has been changed over the years and is now called the 9-dash line.
Yeah, they probably just drew longer lines.
Which could be.
I'm such a card, man, I tell you.
But so they asserted control over the bulk of that area and basing their claim on historical Chinese merchants in fishing.
Yeah, you said
that took place across that area. And so there are a number of island areas and reefs and other features that they claim to be part of China, and there are some historical records showing at certain times under Chinese dynasties back before the Republic of China was established in the early 1900s that asserted jurisdictional control over some of these island areas, but there are also records showing that the Vietnamese were exercising control over some of these areas as well, and it could, it's possible.
Well, the European powers were in there at one point,
Well, they
too,
came
right?
in the 1800s. Well, they came in beginning in the early 1500s when the Portuguese arrived, and later the Dutch came in, and in the 1800s the French showed up, and they took control over what was called Indochina at that time, which
became
controls
French.
what today French Indochina, which
Right.
what today is Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam.
Yeah.
But at that time they had other divisions as to what the countries were before them. But then there was a back and forth between the French and the Chinese over who controlled some of those islands at that point.
Now, I got a question for you, and it's a shame I didn't think of this sooner, and I'm not ashamed of showing my historical and geographical ignorance either.
Well, I didn't know any of this before
Yeah, well,
three days ago, and I'll probably forget it tomorrow. But.
Well, I'm actually encouraging anybody that would like to call in to not be afraid of, being wrong or anything else, because I don't care if I'm wrong. I mean, if I don't know something or if I'm wrong about something I believe, I prefer to be at least the second person to know, Anyhow, was China always considered one country? I know there were many different dynasties we've heard about, but did they really claim the territory that is recognized as China today?
No, it was interesting. I came across a dynamic map on one of the Wikipedia pages I was looking at on China, and it's the history of China, I believe, is the web page. But they've got a map that goes through changes showing what geographic areas were controlled by various dynasties at various times. And it started rather small up in what would be northeastern portion of China today. And then there were periods when it split up into multiple countries within, various competing warring factions of competing dynasties. And then there would be dynasties that would conquer one another. Several of them lasted for about 300 years. The Republic was established, I believe, in 1911, and for about 300 years before that, it was ruled by the Qing dynasty, which installed itself by rebelling against the previous dynasty, which was the Ming dynasty, which it had lasted for about 300 years.
Right. The British came in. The British were in there. The United States was in there in the late 19th century. That's what was it the British? They established the tea trade there, right?
Well, yeah, I think that it would have been during the Qing dynasty that these various intrusions by European colonial powers came along. Hong Kong was set up as a British colony.
That was a colony.
They didn't try to take over the whole continent like they did with India. They just had their small, but then they had influence beyond Hong Kong.
Okay, my point is, though, that China didn't even have control of itself before 1947, really. So
well, it depends on what you say control of itself, because these dynasties had a certain administrative power, and they had jurisdiction over some of these islands in the South China Sea through their administrative agencies. One of the problems there was corruption of the administrative state of China.
Oh, sure.
And a lot of people fled China, and so you had migration.
And of course, corrupt governments are easy to exploit, easy for foreign powers to exploit. That was what we found out was done in the Middle East by the Western European powers after World War I. And then actually we did that in Vietnam. We and the French. When they were split in two countries, we put our puppets in South Vietnam and said, "Hey, they asked us to come here. We're authorized," and made it legitimate, so to speak. But anyway, So all this, even China itself, was in contest. What I was mentioning or thinking about when I said that about China not even having control of itself, I recall reading Smedley Butler's autobiography and a few other books about him, and he was over there as a Marine in the late 19th century, protecting Standard Oil's assets. And I believe there were civil wars going on around the area, and that's why the U.S. Marines were sent there to protect U.S. oil assets that existed there at the time.
Yeah, well, the civil wars began, from what I was reading a couple of days ago, there were civil wars beginning in the 1920s, I believe, which was shortly after the Republic was established in 1911, I think. Yeah. And the civil wars were between the communists and the nationalists.
Right.
And they formed a united front against the Japanese when the Imperial Japanese came in the 1930s, and then at the end of the Second World War, then they resumed their civil war against each other until the nationalists were left holding Taiwan, and the communists had the rest of China.
Right. Yeah, holding it for now anyway. But after all, if China gets away with taking over the different islands in the South China Sea or taking control of it.
It's interesting. Both the People's Republic of China, the communist, the mainland, and then also the Republic of China, Taiwan. Both of them rely on the 9-dash line, and both of them lay claim to all of the South China Sea.
So Yeah, and so it's either an eventual. Well, yeah, that's another issue there, and I don't need to show my smart aleckiness anymore. But what about the Philippines' claim to the different areas? I know that right now they're drawing from a major source of natural gas, the Malampaya field, but that's in danger of running out in less than a decade, and so they're looking at areas like the Reed Bank, which I guess is out near the Scarborough Shoals, or it's somewhere within
Okay,
Philippines.
I'm not familiar
Regardless,
with just where
but
these different fields are. There.
Well, it's
but
it's near the Philippines.
yeah, well, within the disputes around the South China Sea claim of China, there are maritime disputes, and then there's disputes over geographic features like islands in reefs in the Scarborough.
What's the difference?
Reef. So, well, the big claim over the maritime disputes is who gets to control and exploit the resources in the seabed.
We haven't talked about
Because
those yet, but yeah.
If you have your 200-mile exclusive economic zone reach out into the sea, you can, even though the surface is international waters for shipping purposes, the seabed in what's below it is subject in the resources of the sea, the fisheries and such.
Or yours,
or
to
under
control.
your control,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, and okay, so anyway, let's get back and talk a little bit about the Philippines. What is their historical claim?
Well, their disputes with China over the Scarborough Reef area.
Okay.
And that's why we went to this international tribunal in The Hague, which Philippines brought the case claiming that this was theirs, and China refused to participate in the proceedings.
And then the Hague court unanimously and convincingly came down on the side of the Philippines.
Yeah.
However, like you said, China did not acknowledge the authority of the court in The Hague and just blew it off, essentially. They said they weren't going to pay attention to it or acknowledge it. But, the Philippines, you were saying they have a historic claim. There's been a long history of the Philippines controlling that part of the South China Sea, right?
Well, not so far the sea is the feature.
Right, they're close. Well, yeah, but they control the Scarborough Shoals, yes, which is part of what China is now claiming with its 9-dash line, though. That's why I'm bringing it up. Right.
That's why there was a conflict between the Philippines and China, because China was claiming it under their 9-dash line assertion of control.
Right,
and the Philippines were claiming it over historical purposes, saying that they presented a lot of evidence. The opinion's over 500 pages, and I didn't read through all that, but I've seen some reports on what they relied on. It included things like when the Spanish first arrived there, the Philippine fishermen were already using that place for fishing and for seeking safe harbor in stormy conditions.
Right, but then, of course, when Spain took over the Philippines and made them their colony, it became Spain's area of control. And then when we took Philippines from Spain as the rising colonial power, we became in control of it.
And then after the Philippines was given independence by the United States, and we had naval bases there for quite a while, this area was used for as a live range for weapons operations by the U.S. military in conjunction with the Philippines.
But it's acknowledged.
Navy.
It's acknowledged now that the Philippines control it.
Yeah.
And we probably have a treaty with them to defend it, too, against China or any other interlopers.
Well, that's an issue, in these disputes over all of these areas.
Right, yeah.
Within the South China Sea is to what extent the U.S. is going to be called upon if it turns to
war, yeah.
War, yeah.
And I think we'll just, with our current administration anyway, I think we'll just shrug it off and say, nah, we ain't doing it. But let me remind the listeners that you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Feel free to call in and join the discussion, 343-9927, 343-9927. So, Lang, we mentioned Paracel Islands, the Spratly Islands, Scarborough Shoals. Is there a significance to the term island as opposed to something else?
Well, in the decision,
The Hague decision.
The Hague decision, they ruled that certain of these features were rocks and not islands. And I don't know how they determine which it is, but the consequence of that distinction is that if it's an island and it's your island, and then your country can assert the 200-mile exclusive economic zone authority 200 miles out from that island, whereas if it's only a rock, you can only assert the 12-mile
sovereignty zone.
Sovereignty, yeah.
Okay, and whether or not there are, in fact, islands there, I believe China is creating some. Are they
well,
not?
that's a whole other angle on the dispute over the South China Sea. Is
they're making land there. Yeah.
They've been building, and this was mentioned in the Hague, the decision by the court in The Hague as well, because of their the obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea to not do damage to the ecology, and they have been dredging and destroying coral reefs and dredging up and building islands. This has been in the news recently, where satellite imagery shows constructed hangars that can accommodate bombers and other large...
And airstrips that can handle the landing of heavy bombers and things like that.
Right.
So, I mean, that's some significant building of islands.
Right.
You know.
And so yeah. So the Hague decision, from what I read about it, didn't talk about the military implications of that, but about the damage that was done to the ecology in this construction work.
Right, and it wasn't just the islands they were creating, was it? It was also the clam.
Well, that was
harvesting.
also mentioned in this the destruction. There was even more destruction to coral reefs done by the harvesting of the giant clams, which are taken to China they use the shells to make artworks.
They don't even make
sold to tourists, and then the meat is used as a delicacy and an aphrodisiac.
Oh,
so it's a big demand. They had destroyed or harvested all of the giant clams that were up in the Chinese water. So now they're sending the boats out to these other areas that China's claiming under the 9-dash line.
You know, the Chinese, as I understand it, the Chinese, okay, they use this clam as an aphrodisiac. I didn't know that. But they import the horns of rhinoceroses, I believe, or rhinoceri for an aphrodisiac. Isn't there something with the tiger that they also use as an aphrodisiac? I mean,
I wouldn't know.
I'm wondering do the people of China have some kind of sexual problem? You know, I don't know. You know, they just seem to have a fixation on aphrodisiac, and I don't disagree that sex isn't, is fun, but usually people don't have to take so many aphrodisiacs to enjoy it, But anyhow, I would say I digress, but I actually degenerate. But let's see here. Okay, building the islands. I wanted to share something with you and the listeners, Lang. I got to thinking about it, and I thought, man, to build these islands, and especially islands that are firm enough to handle military aircraft landing and taking off, that you have to move a lot of soil or silt or something, And what I saw, and I think you saw the pictures too, the overhead or pictures from the sky, you could see where they started out with an area that was largely submerged, with a few little rocks pointing above poking above the surface of the ocean. But now they've dredged up the surrounding silt and soil from the bottom of the ocean and built it up into these massive islands that can handle, a lot of heavy traffic from the air. And I thought, well, how in the heck could they move that much dirt or soil or whatever? And I discovered that this actually was a new thing that came out. The BBC reported it in November of last year. But they have what the manufacturer of this ship calls a, quote, magic island-making ship. And it's called the Tycoon Howl. which is the name of a legendary enormous fish which can turn into a mythical bird. But it's 460 feet long. It's the biggest ship of its kind in China, according to the designers, and it is capable of digging 6,000 cubic meters an hour, the equivalent of 3 standard swimming pools, from 114 feet below the water's surface. That's a lot, and it can convey that material 9 miles away to where it wants to dump it. So this ship can go as far as 9 miles out from the island they want to build and pump 6,000 cubic meters, which I'm guessing is somewhere around maybe 5,000 cubic yards, which is it's a lot. An hour, you know, that's big stuff. And it also says here, which I thought was interesting, because you've mentioned deals that China has been making around the Indian Ocean and Middle East, for a while for ports, seaports. The ship can also be used to dredge deep water ports, so they could pretty much go anywhere in the world and make deals with governments that don't like us, and they're increasingly, a lot of them, and build these deep water ports where they can station their ships or establish really good trade relations and things like that.
Yeah, it opens up a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, and so that's part of the concern or whatever with the South China Sea and what they're doing. But what are some other features in South China Sea that make the area valuable? What are there that make it valuable? Aside from the competing claims, there are several things that make that part of the world highly valuable to everyone.
Well, there's a lot of fisheries there. There are oil and gas reserves there. There's strategic shipping lanes. Over half of the world's crude is shipped through the South China Sea. In fact,
well, yeah, but I mean, half the world's. I'm looking here at Business Insider article. It says here a third of all maritime traffic worldwide. A third of all maritime traffic passes through this choke point of the South China Sea, and you're saying along with that, there's half of the oil that's carried around the world or all over the world and traded passes through there also. Mm-hmm. So those right there are strategic assets, really, which oil is, in fact, that's been recognized as a strategic asset. And the way I understand that to mean is that you may not need it yourself, but if you control it, you've got a large bit of control over a good part of the developed world. And of course, China, that's one of the biggest threats I think that we're facing here, or that the other countries are concerned about.
Yeah, so I think there's a similarity between what China's interest in that area is with what the U.S. interest in the Middle East was for access to strategic oil reserves back decades ago.
And China's making inroads there, too, as we withdraw, but they're making deals with their One Belt, One Road initiative to put in a seaport in Pakistan, and I thought you said there was one other place, but they can go all around Africa where their influence is tremendous right now.
Yeah, the One Belt, One Road also included plans for a port on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean.
Okay, we got a call coming in. Just a second here. Good evening. You're on a pause for thought. My nose calling, please.
Hi, Wayne and Lang. This is Brian Marks calling.
Hey, Brian.
Listen to y'all's conversation about the South China Sea. I have lived and have worked over in Vietnam for my job, and one of the things I think that needs to be understood about the value of this part of the world, there aren't necessarily really the economic resources that are justified, or even the shipping of things. Part of that is true, part of that is what you've been talking about, and that's valid. But a lot of this has to do with a domestic audience of the Chinese state and the Vietnamese state, the governments, and the return of a kind of aggressive nationalism to East Asia, in which it's not even about what's offshore. It's about the governments of these countries rallying the populace at home. I mean, when you go to Vietnam, you see little kids in schools, public schools, are told, bring a rock to the Army, to the Navy in this case, and there's a ceremony. People do this all the time. And, give a rock to build an island, and it's all about the Vietnamese nation has to claim these islands. And so there's
political
things that have nothing to do with actually what's out there. It's
Sure.
about maintaining the legitimacy of particularly of Vietnam and China, and not quote unquote backing down. So that's a part of what's going on with all this.
No, I'm sure you're right, Brian. I'm sure you are. In fact, you reminded me of the anti-China protests that flared up suddenly and very quickly in Vietnam when China first towed an oil drilling rig into the South China Sea off of Vietnam.
Yep.
And that was very easy to apparently. I noticed just how quickly that happened, and I thought, wow, how could people organize and get together that fast? And then you just explained that, but
well, and these things are a little tricky because in countries like China and Vietnam, they don't really want people to get out in the street for anything.
No, they don't want them to feel their power. Yeah.
Well, and very quickly, if you start saying the Chinese Communist Party is bad and is doing bad things, pretty quickly it can lead over to our own government is bad and doing things. I think people are actually a little less buying into this. I think a lot of people over there are actually quite cynical, but there is this new nationalism. I mean, we're getting it in America, we're getting it in Europe, all over the world, of saying this belongs to us, and it's a way for governments to try to rally around the flag. And but potentially it's got some. Well, they could go to war. They could actually have a real war, which I don't think either of them wants. And they're a little nervous, I think, in Vietnam about how this gets carried along. So, anyway, observations of mine from being over.
No, and I really appreciate that, Brian. I appreciate it a lot. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, there's some good insights from someone who's been there, and we forgot about that aspect of it. It could be just all bluster, but bluster can lead to serious consequences.
Yeah, you never know. Like he was talking about, raise the concerns of the people against the Chinese and communists.
Yeah, I mean, none of those countries
turn it against your own government,
right? And of course, our government doesn't really like it when people in America rise up in large numbers either. I mean, look at the Vietnam protests and how Nixon, the crimes he committed trying to suppress and sabotage those movements. So any country's government, any government at all, really doesn't want its people rising up and feeling their power. In fact, that was one of the reasons why they demonized, or the right demonized Saul Alinsky, because he was good at organizing people locally and making them realize that they didn't need money, they needed just numbers. And anyhow, good points by Brian, the caller. But nevertheless, though, there are serious concerns about countries that want access to the South China Sea. So if any of this comes about, or if there is fighting, we're all going to suffer. But global trade will be hurt severely, and it can't be a good situation for anyone with that. Okay. Well, now I'm kind of thrown off. We got a few minutes left to wrap this up. I'm trying to. Well, let me just look at my notes here. Oh, as far as what Brian was saying, I think that's true. A lot is being made of the hydrocarbons below the South China Sea, but really, the U.S. Geological Survey in 1993-94, it estimated 266 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, which I guess is significant, but only about 28 billion barrels of oil. So there's really not. I mean, I guess that's a lot, but it's not a significant amount compared to Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Iraq. So like Brian said, it's not necessarily that valuable for the hydrocarbons, but the rabble-rousing, of course, that's always good, and we have to acknowledge that exists, and like Brian said too, it's all over the country, the nationalism and everything, and there are a lot of people in America who buy into that too, and believe anything they're told by their leader regarding it. So anything else quickly, Lang, on the control of the South China Sea? We've got about 30 seconds I can see here, and I'm going to put it on you just to wrap it up.
One thing we hadn't touched on were the clashes over fishing rights there. There's been clashes between various nations. It's not just with China. There's Indonesia has asserted protection for fishing rights in their waters, and they have taken and destroyed fishing vessels from half a dozen or so other countries, including the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnamese fishing ships. So that there's a lot at stake with the various resources that the countries have conflicting claims over.
Yeah, and of course, rabble-rousing aside, building islands is a very real thing, and they are definitely doing that. And they're putting military installations on the islands they're building, as well as other small rocks or whatever, so to speak. They're putting satellite towers or surveillance systems out there. So either way, that China is projecting its power into the South China Sea, and they're going to want to keep that power and keep control of it.
And once you have an island, you've got a stronger case to make for asserting a 200-mile exclusive economic zone around that
the right of conquest, which is no longer, you can no longer conquer, like you said, but if you have conquered in the past, you have a claim of ownership. We got to go, Lang. Thanks a lot. You carried us to the end. You've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on the Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. We thank you for listening. We're out of time. Got to go. You have a good night.